Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. This file is being recorded for the January 2025 edition of Socialism for All, and it's an audiobook and discussion of Kapital, Volume 1, Chapter 7, The Labor Process and the Process of Producing Surplus Value, by Karl Marx from 1867. If you like this video, please click like and subscribe, and consider supporting on Patreon or Buy Me a Coffee at patreon.com/socialismforall or buymeacoffee.com/socialismforall. If you do sign up on Patreon, please use the Android app or the website, as the Apple iOS app will charge you an extra 30 to 40%, all of which goes to Apple. There are links to Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee in the video description. So Chapter 7, The Labor Process and the Process of Producing Surplus Value, marks the start of Part 3, The Production of Absolute Surplus Value. Parts 1 and 2, which are comprised of Chapters 1 through 3 and 4 through 6 respectively, I feel are already pretty well summed up at this point in our reading, and Chapter 6 in particular I feel really encapsulates everything up to that point. So if you do feel shaky on any of that earlier material, please do go back and review it to your satisfaction, because from this point forward we won't really be reviewing basic concepts like use value and exchange value. So back to Chapter 7, again, it is the first chapter in Part 3, the production of absolute surplus value, and that part extends up through Chapter 11. This is then followed by Part 4, the production of relative surplus value, Chapters 12 through 15, which is then followed by Part 5, the production of absolute and relative surplus value, Chapters 16 through 18. There are still 3 additional parts and 33 chapters in total, but the point here is that we're going to be discussing these concepts, the production of absolute and relative surplus value, at some length in the coming chapters, hence the change in focus. So let's talk about surplus value a bit. Surplus value in general is the portion of the value produced in a workday by the workers which is not paid back to the workers. It is the source of profit in capitalism. Essentially, the social contract in capitalism is that workers work for capitalists because workers don't own their own means of production, which is to say the workplace, the equipment, the raw materials, everything basically other than the labor power, which is what the workers bring to the equation. So the capitalist, who controls all of this and controls the hiring and firing of the workers, which is to say access to the means of production, buys from the workers their labor power or capacity to work. The price of this labor power is known as wages. So labor power is treated as a commodity, and as we know, the price of a commodity is its average cost of production. At any given time in the marketplace, some sellers are able to sell above cost, while others have to sell below cost. But in general, on average, the price of a commodity is the cost of its production. So what's the cost of the production of labor power? Basically the subsistence of the worker. So that's what the capitalist pays for. In exchange for those wages, the capitalist gets a value-producing commodity. In fact, the only value-producing commodity, labor power, or again, workers' capacity to work. Once applied, under the direction of the capitalist, it produces all kinds of goods and services, which then automatically become the legal property of the capitalist. So, the difference in value between the goods and services produced and the labor power that the capitalist paid for is surplus value. So we have a transactional situation here in which the workers are interested in getting as much money as possible for their labor power, and the capitalist has the exact opposite antagonistic interest. They want as much labor power as they can get their hands on while paying the lowest wages that they possibly can. Because again, from the capitalist's perspective, the value of the goods and services produced during the workday, which belongs to them, minus the wages that they pay out, is the surplus value, and they want as much of that as they can get. So, in parts 3 and 4 of Kapital Volume 1, what we're going to talk about is how they go about trying to do that. The overall logic of the situation and the capitalist's material interests in it are not really complicated, so this boils down to 2 fairly simple things. Absolute surplus value, the subject of Part 3, which describes capitalists' efforts to increase surplus value by extending the length of the working day. So let's say, for example, that it takes a worker 2 hours in the course of their working day to generate enough value in the form of goods and/or services to cover the cost of their wages. Well, the longer that the capitalist can keep them working beyond that, the more surplus value the capitalist gets at the end of the day. So that is an increase in the absolute surplus value. Now, relative surplus value, which is the subject of Part 4, is surplus value generated by the capitalist's cutting of wages. So, in essence, you might still have an 8-hour day, But because the capitalist is now paying less for wages, it takes less time proportionally for the worker to produce enough value in the form of goods and/or services to cover those wages. So again, wages is the name for the price of labor power, so this is tied into discussions about cost of living, which is then connected with a concept called necessary labor time. This is basically the amount of time that workers need to work in order to produce enough value to sustain themselves. And then as they continue working beyond that, that's surplus labor time, during which is produced surplus value. So in the course of a workday, the workers spend some amount of time producing value in the form of goods and services to cover their wages. Again, that's necessary labor time. And if you could just clock out at that point, the workers would be happy, but the capitalist would not be. Why not? Because they didn't get any surplus value. That's why they keep you working there long after this time. It's all about getting as much surplus value as they can get, which is again the source of profit. Alright, I think that's enough of an introduction. Let's get into Chapter 7. Section 1. The labor process or the production of use values. The capitalist buys labor power in order to use it, and labor power in use is labor itself. The purchaser of labor power consumes it by setting the seller of it to work. By working, the latter becomes actually what before they only were potentially, labor power in action, a laborer. In order that their labor may reappear in a commodity, they must, before all things, expend it on something useful, on something capable of satisfying a want of some sort. Hence, what the capitalist sets the laborer to produce is a particular use value, a specified article. The fact that the production of use values or goods is carried on under the control of a capitalist and on their behalf does not alter the general character of that production. We shall therefore, in the first place, have to consider the labor process independently of the particular form it assumes under given social conditions. Labor is, in the first place, a process in which both humans and nature participate, and in which humans, of our own accord, start, regulate, and control the material reactions upon ourselves and nature. We oppose ourselves to nature as one of her own forces, setting in motion arms and legs, head and hands, the natural forces of the body, in order to appropriate nature's productions in a form adapted to our own wants. By thus acting on the external world and changing it, we at the same time change our own nature. We develop our slumbering powers and compel them to act in obedience to our sway. We are not now dealing with those primitive, instinctual forms of labor that remind us of the mere animal. An immeasurable interval of time separates the state of things in which a human brings their labor power to market for sale as a commodity from that state in which human labor was still in its first instinctive stage. We presuppose labor in a form that stamps it as exclusively human. A spider conducts operations that resemble those of a weaver, and a bee puts to shame many an architect in the construction of her cells. But what distinguishes the worst architect from the best of the bees is this, that the architect raises their structure in imagination before they erect it in reality. At the end of every labor process, we get a result that already existed in the imagination of the laborer at its commencement. They not only effect a change of form in the material on which they work, but they also realize a purpose of their own that gives the law to their modus operandi, and to which they must subordinate their will. And this subordination is no mere momentary act. Besides the exertion of the bodily organs, the process demands that during the whole operation, the worker's will be steadily in consonance with their purpose. This means close attention. The less they are attracted by the nature of the work and the mode in which it's carried on, and the less, therefore, they enjoy it as something which gives play to their bodily and mentally powers, the more close their attention is forced to be. So commenting, Marx here is clearly distinguishing human labor, both from any kind of non-human activity or behavior, even if it results in the construction of something such as a beehive, a spider web, a beaver dam, etc., and also from less developed kinds of human activity, what Marx is referring to as an instinctive stage of labor. This is summed up in the phrase, we presuppose labor in a form that stamps it as exclusively human. So what makes it exclusively human? Well, basically some kind of intellect, imagination, attention, will, and purpose, something that's pre-planned, deliberate, and maybe carried out against one's more base desires to go do something else. So kind of also implying a delay of gratification. How much these things are truly exclusively human is up for debate, but the extent or degree to which humans engage in these kinds of behaviors compared to other animals is certainly much greater. It is this abstract sort of general intelligence, not infinite intelligence, but a multifaceted intelligence, which is adaptable to many, maybe not all, but many types of activity. That seems to be what, to Marx, sets humans apart. But I think it is important to note that Marx starts out this section by saying that labor is a process in which both humans and nature participate, the phrasing of which implies that humans are not part of nature. Now, obviously, biologically we are. We evolved just like every other organism on the earth did. So, is there something unnatural about us? If so, it would seem to be our general intelligence. But if that intelligence is a product of our bodies, which are products of nature, how would it be unnatural? To me, the problem here is that nature is a sloppy concept. It is somewhat meaningless to say that humans are capable of unnatural acts. All organisms seem to have some capacity for understanding and choice, even if very small, based on different circumstances that they may find themselves in. It just seems to be the case that humans have significantly more, which has enabled us to develop technologies which probably no other organism would ever be able to develop, even given infinite time. So basically, the concept of nature seems to be a stand-in for what happens on Earth when humans aren't around. We should really improve on this concept. And I don't mean to beat Marx up about it, because Marx is not really the originator of this view. But in my opinion, for the kind of socialism we need now that we have extinction-level technology, we really need to do better than just the man and nature dichotomy. We are part of nature. That is, we evolved on this planet just like every other organism evolved on this planet. We also specifically evolved an intelligence which allows us to engage in deliberate acts of change to that environment on now currently a scale which is completely unprecedented in history as far as we know. Literally at this point, we could blow up the planet. That was not possible even 100 years ago, let alone 100 million years ago. It is, as far as we know, the only time in the history of this planet that any organism on this planet has had the ability to destroy the planet. And it may be the only such case in the entire universe because we haven't been able to examine evidence of such a thing arising on any other planet so far. So anyway, Marx draws a distinction between quote-unquote natural activity and deliberate human labor. It's comprehensible and workable as a concept within the framework that we're using here. But again, I believe that we do need a more holistic concept of nature as something that humans are part of, including our labor. To me, this seems to be a serious weak point in the ongoing discussions about how humans can come to account for the effects of the technology that we have invented. In other words, it seems that humans are very good at solving problems right in front of our faces, and our evolutionary trajectory has put a lot of pressure on us developing this ability to come up with really clever ways to solve particular problems affecting our immediate environment and survival. What we seem to not be so good at is thinking globally. After all, for 100,000 years, we really haven't had to. There's been comparatively little evolutionary pressure on us to develop that kind of thinking. Yet quite suddenly, from an evolutionary standpoint, in the last few hundred to few thousand years, we have developed and are using technology which is capable of affecting continents and then the entire planet, and yet that represents a relatively few amount of generations of human reproduction. We just haven't been able biologically to have much in the way of adaptation to those rapidly emerging circumstances. So these very new technologies with unprecedented reach are in the hands of and being used by organisms which seem to show a clear propensity, or at least are easily induced, to think mainly about what's right in front of us and treat the future and what's happening on the other side of the planet as basically unreal. It's a dangerous and potentially apocalyptic situation. We are suddenly in a situation where there is evolutionary pressure on us to figure this out, but it's kind of an all-or-nothing scenario potentially. Bringing this back around to capitalism and the proletarian revolution against it, we know that a proletarian internationalism is critical in winning this struggle, and I think at this point it's clear that the kind of eco-socialism that must emerge is one with a planned economy which factors all of these things in off the bat before production is ever entered. Because even compared to Lenin's time 100 years ago, yes, even socialist-directed production could be polluting and things like that, but now we're actually at a level where human technology could cause a planet-wide ecological collapse. Capitalism, with its need for short-term profit chasing, is leading us toward that rapidly. And part of overcoming the capitalism means bringing in this much broader, more holistic, if you will, dialectical way of thinking about production and the environment and ecology, humans and nature. So, this is the point that Marx is making is kind of a typical framing of the past, but I do think that we need to move beyond that kind of dichotomy. All right, with that said, let's get back to the text. The elementary factors of the labor process are 1, the personal activity of humans, i.e. work itself, 2, the subject of that work, and 3, its instruments. The soil, and this economically speaking includes water, in the virgin state in which it supplies humans with necessaries, or the means of subsistence ready to hand, exists independently of us, and is the universal subject of human labor. All those things which labor merely separates from immediate connection with their environment are subjects of labor spontaneously provided by nature. Such are fish which we catch and take from their element, water, timber which we fell in the virgin forest, and ores which we extract from their veins. If, on the other hand, the subject of labor has, so to say, been filtered through previous labor, we call it raw material, such as ore already extracted and ready for washing. All raw material is the subject of labor, but not every subject of labor is raw material, i.e. already worked on. It can only become so after it has undergone some alteration by means of labor. And there's a footnote there quoting James Stewart's Principles of Political Economy, the earth's spontaneous productions being in small quantity and quite independent of man, appear, as it were, to be furnished by nature, in the same way as a small sum is given to a young man in order to put him in a way of industry and of making his fortune. Kind of like Trump's small loan of $1 million, which actually was more like $61 million or $140 million in today's terms. Back to the main text. An instrument of labor is a thing, or a complex of things, which the laborer interposes between themselves and the subject of their labor, and which serves as the conductor of their activity. They make use of the mechanical, physical, and chemical properties of some substances in order to make other substances subservient to their aims. Quoting Hegel, reason is just as cunning as she is powerful. Her cunning consists principally in her mediating activity, which, by causing objects to act and react on each other, in accordance with their own nature, in this way, without any direct interference in the process, carries out reason's intentions." Unquote. Leaving out of consideration such ready-made means of subsistence as fruits, in gathering which a person's own limbs serve as the instruments of their labor, the first thing of which the laborer possesses themselves is not the subject of labor, but its instrument. Thus nature becomes one of the organs of their activity, one that they annex to their own bodily organs, adding stature to themselves in spite of the Bible. As the earth is their original larder, so too is it their original tool house. It supplies them, for instance, with stones for throwing, grinding, pressing, cutting, etc. The earth itself is an instrument of labor, but when used as such in agriculture implies a whole series of other instruments and a comparatively high development of labor. In his otherwise miserable work, Theory of Political Economy, Ginil enumerates in a striking manner, in opposition to the physiocrats, the long series of previous processes necessary before agriculture properly so called can commence. No sooner does labor undergo the least development than it requires specially prepared instruments. Thus, in the oldest caves, we find stone implements and weapons. In the earliest period of human history, domesticated animals, i.e., animals which have been bred for the purpose and have undergone modifications by means of labor, play the chief part as instruments of labor along with specially prepared stones, wood, bones, and shells. Turgot, in his Reflections on the Formation and Distribution of Wealth, brings well into prominence the importance of domesticated animals to early civilization. The use and fabrication of instruments of labor, although existing in the germ among certain species of animals, is specifically characteristic of the human labor process, and Franklin therefore defines man as a tool-making animal. Relics of bygone instruments of labor possess the same importance for the investigation of extinct economic forms of society as do fossil bones for the determination of extinct species of animals. It is not the articles made, but how they are made and by what instruments that enables us to distinguish different economic epochs. Footnote here, the least important commodities of all for the technological comparison of different epochs of production are articles of luxury in the strict meaning of the term. However little our written histories up to this time notice the development of material production, which is the basis of all social life and therefore of all real history, yet prehistoric times have been classified in accordance with the results, not of so-called historical, but of materialistic investigations. These periods have been divided to correspond with the materials from which their implements and weapons were made, viz. Into the Stone, the Bronze, and the Iron Ages. Back to the main text. Instruments of labor not only supply a standard of the degree of development to which human labor has attained, but they are also indicators of the social conditions under which that labor is carried on. Among the instruments of labor, those of a mechanical nature, which taken as a whole we may call the bone and muscles of production, offer much more decided characteristics of a given epoch of production than those which, like pipes, tubs, baskets, jars, etc., serve only to hold the materials for labor, which latter class we may call in a general way the vascular system of production. The latter first begins to play an important role in the chemical industries. In a wider sense, we may include among the instruments of labor, in addition to those things that are used for directly transferring labor to its subject, and which therefore, in one way or another, serve as conductors of activity, all such objects as are necessary for carrying on the labor process. These do not enter directly into the process, but without them it's either impossible for it to take place at all, or possible only to a partial extent. Once more, we find the earth to be a universal instrument of this sort, for it furnishes a locus standi to the laborer and a field of employment for their activity. Among instruments that are the result of previous labor and also belong to this class, we find workshops, canals, roads, and so forth. In the labor process, therefore, humans' activity, with the help of the instruments of labor, effects an alteration, designed from the commencement in the material worked upon. The process disappears in the product. The latter is a use value, nature's material adapted by a change of form to the wants of humans. Labor has incorporated itself with its subject. The former is materialized, the latter transformed. That which in the laborer appeared as movement now appears in the product as a fixed quality without motion. The blacksmith forges, and the product is a forging. If we examine the whole process from the point of view of its result, the product, it is plain that both the instruments and the subject of labor are means of production, and that the labor itself is productive labor. 2 footnotes here. The first, it appears paradoxical to assert that uncaught fish, for instance, are a means of production in the fishing industry, but hitherto no one has discovered the art of catching fish in waters that contain none. Second, this method of determining from the standpoint of the labor process alone what is productive labor is by no means directly applicable to the case of the capitalist process of production. So comment here, the quote was, if we examine the whole process from the point of view of its result, the product, it is plain that both the instruments and the subject of labor are means of production, and that the labor itself is productive labor. This is referring to the earlier sentence about the blacksmith forges and the product is a forging. That appears in the laborer, in this case a blacksmith, as movement, but now it appears in the product, whatever the blacksmith was making, incorporated as a fixed quality without motion. It's no longer in the process of being forged. That is in the past. But on the subject of productive labor, let's not get ahead of ourselves, those who know some Marxist terminology. Productive labor in capitalism is labor which produces profit. It's distinct from useful labor in something like the way that use value and exchange value are different. Useful labor creates use values. Productive labor in capitalist society produces profit. So even in capitalist society, labor can be useful without being productive. In other words, it does not expand capital. So coming back to the footnote, this method of determining from the standpoint of the labor process alone what is productive labor is by no means directly applicable to the case of the capitalist process of production. Alright, back to the main text. Though a use value in the form of a product issues from the labor process, yet other use values, products of previous labor, enter into it as means of production. The same use value is both the product of a previous process and a means of production in a later process. Products are therefore not only results, but also essential conditions of labor. With the exception of the extractive industries, in which the material for labor is provided immediately by nature, such as mining, hunting, fishing, and agriculture, so far as the latter is confined to breaking up virgin soil, all branches of industry manipulate raw material, objects already filtered through labor, already products of labor, such as seed in agriculture. Animals and plants, which we are accustomed to consider as products of nature, are in their present form not only products of, say, last year's labor, but the result of a gradual transformation continued through many generations under human superintendence and by means of our labor. But in the great majority of cases, instruments of labor show, even to the most superficial observer, traces of the labor of past ages. So comment, Marx is basically saying that this process builds on itself. Even the seed that you're going to plant has to have been collected, which is labor. Continuing, raw material may either form the principal substance of a product, or it may enter into its formation only as an accessory. An accessory may be consumed by the instruments of labor, as coal under a boiler, oil by a wheel, hay by draft horses, or it may be mixed with the raw material in order to produce some modification thereof, as chlorine into unbleached linen, coal with iron, dye stuff with wool, or again, it may help to carry on the work itself, as in the case of the materials used for heating and lighting workshops. The distinction between principal substance and accessory vanishes in the true chemical industries, because there, none of the raw material reappears in its original composition in the substance of the product. Footnote here, Storch calls true raw materials, in French, matière, and accessory material, matériaux. Cherbulier describes accessories as matière instrumentale. Back to the main text. Every object possesses various properties and is thus capable of being applied to different uses. One and the same product may therefore serve as raw material in very different processes. Corn, for example, is a raw material for millers, starch manufacturers, distillers, and cattle breeders. It also enters as raw material into its own production in the shape of seed. Coal, too, is at the same time the product of, and a means of production in, coal mining. Again, a particular product may be used in one and the same process, both as an instrument of labor and as raw material. Take, for instance, the fattening of cattle, where the animal is the raw material and at the same time an instrument for the production of manure. A product, though ready for immediate consumption, may yet serve as raw material for a further product, as grapes when they become the raw material for wine. On the other hand, labor may give us its product in such a form that we can use it only as raw material, as is the case with cotton, thread, and yarn. Such a raw material, though itself a product, may have to go through a whole series of different processes. In each of these in turn, it serves, with constantly varying form, as raw material, until the last process of the series leaves it a perfect product, ready for individual consumption or for use as an instrument of labor. Hence we see that whether a use value is to be regarded as raw material, as an instrument of labor, or as a product, this is determined entirely by its function in the labor process, by the position it there occupies. As this varies, so does its character. Whenever, therefore, a product enters as a means of production into a new labor process, it thereby loses its character of product and becomes a mere factor in the process. A spinner treats spindles only as implements for spinning, and flax only as the material that they spin. Of course, it is impossible to spin without material and spindles, and therefore the existence of these things as products at the commencement of the spinning operation must be presumed. But in the process itself, the fact that they are products of previous labor is a matter of utter indifference. Just as in the digestive process, it's of no importance whatever that bread is the produce of the previous labor of the farmer, the miller, and the baker. On the contrary, it is generally by their imperfections as products that the means of production in any process assert themselves in their character of products. A blunt knife or weak thread forcibly remind us of Mr. A, the cutler, or Mr. B, the spinner. In the finished product, the labor by means of which it has acquired its useful qualities is not palpable, has apparently vanished. A machine which does not serve the purposes of labor is useless. In addition, it falls a prey to the destructive influence of natural forces. Iron rusts and wood rots. Yarn with which we neither weave nor knit is cotton wasted. Living labor must seize upon these things and rouse them from their death sleep, change them from mere possible use values into real and effective ones. Bathed in the fire of labor, appropriated as part and parcel of labor's organism, and, as it were, made alive for the performance of their functions in the process, they are in truth consumed, but consumed with a purpose, as elementary constituents of new use values, of new products, ever ready as means of subsistence for individual consumption, or as means of production for some new labor process. If then, on the one hand, finished products are not only results, but also necessary conditions of the labor process, on the other hand, their assumption into that process, their contact with living labor, is the sole means by which they can be made to retain their character of use values and be utilized. Labor uses up its material factors, its subject and its instruments, consumes them, and is therefore a process of consumption. Such productive consumption is distinguished from individual consumption by this, that the latter uses up products as means of subsistence for the living individual. The former, as means whereby alone, labor, the labor power of the living individual, is enabled to act. The product, therefore, of individual consumption is the consumer themselves. The result of productive consumption is a product distinct from the consumer. Insofar, then, as its instruments and subjects are themselves products, labor consumes products in order to create products, or, in other words, consumes one set of products by turning them into means of production for another set. But, just as in the beginning, the only participators in the labor process were humans and the earth, which latter exists independently of humans, so even now we still employ in the process many means of production provided directly by nature that do not represent any combination of natural substances with human labor. The labor process, resolved as above into its simple elementary factors, is human action with a view to the production of use values, appropriation of natural substances to human requirements. It is the necessary condition for effecting exchange of matter between humans and nature. It is the everlasting nature-imposed condition of human existence, and therefore is independent of every social phase of that existence, or rather, is common to every such phase. It was therefore not necessary to represent our laborer in connection with other laborers. Humans and our labor on one side, nature and its materials on the other, sufficed. As the taste of the porridge does not tell you who grew the oats, no more does this simple process tell you of itself what are the social conditions under which it's taking place, whether under the slave owner's brutal lash or the anxious eye of the capitalist, whether Cincinnatus carries it on in tilling his modest farm, or a savage in killing wild animals with stones. Let us now return to our would-be capitalist. We left them just after they had purchased, in the open market, all the necessary factors of the labor process, its objective factors, the means of production, as well as its subjective factor, labor power. With the keen eye of an expert, they have selected the means of production and the kind of labor power best adapted to their particular trade, be it spinning, bootmaking, or any other kind. They then proceed to consume the commodity, the labor power that they have just bought, by causing the laborer, the impersonation of that labor power, to consume the means of production by their labor. The general character of the labor process is evidently not changed by the fact that the laborer works for the capitalist instead of for themselves. Moreover, the particular methods and operations employed in bootmaking or spinning are not immediately changed by the intervention of the capitalist. They must begin by taking the labor power as they find it in the market, and consequently be satisfied with labor of such a kind as would be found in the period immediately preceding the rise of capitalists. Changes in the methods of production by the subordination of labor to capital can take place only at a later period, and therefore will have to be treated of in a later chapter. The labor process, turned into the process by which the capitalist consumes labor power, exhibits two characteristic phenomena. First, the laborer works under the control of the capitalist to whom their labor belongs, the capitalist taking good care that the work is done in a proper manner, and that the means of production are used with intelligence so that there's no unnecessary waste of raw material, and no wear and tear of the implements beyond what is necessarily caused by the work. Secondly, the product is the property of the capitalist, and not that of the laborer, its immediate producer. Suppose that a capitalist pays for a day's labor power at its value. Then the right to use that power for a day belongs to them, just as much as the right to use any other commodity, such as a horse, that they've hired for the day. To the purchaser of a commodity belongs its use, and the seller of labor power, by giving their labor, does no more in reality than part with the use value that they have sold. From the instant they step into the workshop, the use value of their labor power, and therefore also its use, which is labor, belongs to the capitalist. By the purchase of labor power, the capitalist incorporates labor as a living ferment with the lifeless constituents of the product. From their point of view, the labor process is nothing more than the consumption of the commodity purchased, i.e. of labor power. But this consumption cannot be effected except by supplying the labor power with the means of production. The labor process is a process between things that the capitalist has purchased, things that have become their property. The product of this process belongs, therefore, to them, just as much as does the wine, which is the product of a process of fermentation completed in their cellar. Footnote there, quoting Chabouillet, products are appropriated before they're converted into capital. This conversion does not secure them from such appropriation. Unquote. And again, the proletarian, by selling their labor for a definite quantity of the necessaries of life, renounces all claim to a share in the product. The mode of appropriation of the products remains the same as before. It is in no way altered by the bargain we have mentioned. The product belongs exclusively to the capitalist, who supplied the raw material and the necessaries of life. And this is a rigorous consequence of the law of appropriation, a law whose fundamental principle was the very opposite, namely, that every laborer has an exclusive right to the ownership of what they produce. Unquote. And quoting James Mill, when the laborers receive wages for their labor, the capitalist is then the owner not of the capital only, he means the means of production, but of the labor also. If what is paid as wages is included, as it commonly is, in the term capital, it is absurd to talk of labor separately from capital. The word capital, as thus employed, includes labor and capital both." Unquote. And that is the end of Section 1, the labor process or the production of use values. We will continue with Section 2 in the next video.